I'd like to begin also by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Noongar people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to thank Jane and all the organisers for such a thought-provoking conference. I've enjoyed all the presentations and it's given me a lot to think about in this presentation as well. So an alternative title might be Reflections of a Human Rights Education Practitioner. And I think what I want to do today, I was really struck by the question that Sharon, you posed, I think at the end of your question, at the end of your presentation, perhaps not a question, but the proposition of how photography can both serve and trouble human rights. And I think we're all grappling with that. And I'm by no means going to offer any solutions or answers to that, but what I want to do today is actually use the international human rights framework and human rights education framework as a frame of reference to explore some of these this uneasy relationship that we've been grappling with here today, and also share with you some examples of where the Human Rights Commission itself has faced some challenges around the use of images and photos in some of our practice, and then also share with you some more positive examples, I guess, for want of a better word, of some of the educative resources that we've been involved in developing. So let me see if I can start with. This photograph here is actually one of the photographs from one of our photographic competitions, one of my favourites. But the quote itself is from the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and relates to the right to education. And obviously that education is both a human right in itself and an indispensable means of realising other human rights. And there are many examples throughout the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and also perhaps a declaration that some of you may be familiar with, but a lesser well-known declaration on human rights education and training, which was it was endorsed in 2011. Article 1 of this declaration says that everyone has the right to know, seek and receive information about all human rights and fundamental freedoms. It goes on to say that human rights education and training comprises all educational, training, information, awareness raising and learning activities. And I think this is interesting when we think about the role of photography and the image in when we think about what is the purpose of an image or a photo. Is the purpose for raising awareness? Is it about documenting a historical in historical forms, be that anthropological or medical or scientific, as we've seen in the colonial context that people have been exploring? Or is it also for the purpose of bearing witness, which I think is a mode that Savendi and Baden spoke about and showed us in their piece yesterday, and is a technique used by human rights defenders in many forms, sometimes with the photographic image, sometimes with just legal witnesses being present at a protest or a rally to bear witness to what might ensue, be that police violence or the actions of alternate opposing protesters. So I think this the role of raising awareness, to me as a human rights educator, is so key when we think about the role of images in our education work. as I mentioned before, the Universal Declaration obviously refers to education should be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And I think the UDHR is such a seminal piece, and I was really interested in some of the presentations yesterday about that point at which photography becomes, with the liberation of the Holocaust camps being so critical in terms of the role of photography in human rights education. The Universal Declaration on the Declaration on Human Rights Education goes on to say that human rights education and training should capitalise on and make use of new information and communication technologies as well as the media. It says the arts should be encouraged as a means of training and raising awareness. So I think it's embedded in these international instruments, that recognition of the role of new technologies and communication strategies to raise awareness about human rights issues. This next slide is a little out of place right here now in the context of my talk, but I was really drawn to this image. It was again one from one of our photographic competitions, and the reason I think that it's so interesting is that because the camera itself is in the picture and the children are engaging, and it's a little bit like Lee's presentation this morning, where there's something of the modern, the developed in the relationship with the children being photographed there as well. I'm not sure I'm articulating that as well. Some of you, I'm sure, will do a better job. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of the value of the image and photographs that it can play in being pivotal in raising awareness about a human rights issue is actually a very current issue. And so I want to share with you a story that Professor Gillian Triggs, our president, shared just last week when she launched the Children's Rights Report. And she shared this story about a boy she calls James, not his real name. He was born in Tidjagala, a remote Aboriginal community, 120 kilometres from Alice Springs, to an Aboriginal mother, and he had epilepsy and a brain injury, and his mother also had a cognitive disability. She was unable to care for him, and he spent most of his childhood moved from one member of the family to another. The government placed him under child protection regime. When 16 years old and staying with his uncle, he was told that he would be returned to Tidjagala to live with an aunt. He waited all day for his uncle to return home to drive him back. He'd packed his backpack and he waited. The uncle returned home that night, and his uncle was drunk and could not take him. James then had a fight with his uncle and took a kitchen knife and killed him. James was arrested but was unfit to stand trial and qualified the verdict of manslaughter with diminished responsibility. Ever since that time, James had been held in maximum security prisons with no proper support services for those with an intellectual disability. This is not an uncommon story. 2 years ago, when he was 22 and an adult, a complaint was made to the Commission by his guardian in respect of being held 16 times in a restraint chair, 16 hours a day in isolation. The Human Rights Commission reported this to Parliament in 2014. that the detention was arbitrary and that the Commonwealth had failed to provide appropriate support services for James. Sadly, this report was ignored by governments and the Parliament, and it took the CCTV's footage showed by the Four Corners to expose the treatment of juveniles in juvenile detention in the Northern Territory. The images of Dylan Voller, and I've explicitly chosen not to show them because I find them so shocking, and I'm sure we've all seen them, and I think someone else spoke about whether we show images or not. Anyway, I chose not to because I find them so horrific. But we've seen those images of him being held in a mechanical restraint chair, hooded and strapped at ankles, wrists and neck. And these images shocked a nation and the world. There is no doubt that the power of these images has played a pivotal role in the attention that's now been brought to the issue and in influencing the Prime Minister to commit to a Royal Commission into the conditions of juvenile detention. So I use that as an example of when there are no images, things can be buried. And so whilst we might question the use and how we use images, I have no doubt as a human rights educator that and advocate that the power of images is critical. However, there are some challenges that we should consider when around the use of images and not use them blindly, I guess. And these issues from a human rights perspective relate to issues of consent and dignity, and I think of Sharon, your elucidation of Frederick Douglass's right to a dignified image is really powerful. I think from a now, I think, more formalised recognition of the right to dignity since the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. I think also of issues of authenticity and accuracy of the image and images that are used. I'm sure some of you have come across the term charity porn, or what's the other term? It's often used. I've lost my thought now, but the use of images to elicit empathy, but also donation by NGOs and charities, and sometimes those images are constructed, we now know, and what's really going on there. So one of the stories I now want to share is actually around the authenticity of images. So these are iStock, think stock images, all images of people with disabilities. Now, they're actually all images that the Human Rights Commission has used in some of our publications. I'm going to show you another image. Anyone notice that all the people who were in wheelchairs are no longer in wheelchairs? And this is one of the challenges of using iStock or ThinkStock images for publication and promotion of issues. So we had used these images in many of our disability rights publications, only to find that they weren't authentic. And I think it's an example of one of the pitfalls around stock images, but also I think we, in the human rights space more than any other space, perhaps if we were a bank using those images, no one would care that these actors turned up somewhere else. For us, it was critical that we use authentic images. another image. This is an image that was one of the in our photographic competition, was the winner of the children's category. So the photographer was a child. Not sure if any of you have seen this image. So I sat at the awards ceremony when this award was being presented to the child and for his photograph, and he got up and he said, I really wanted to tell people how poverty is really bad. He was young. He might have been 10 years old or something, and bring people's attention to really care and worry about poverty in the world. And that's why I dressed my brother up and got him to roll around in the mud and pose in this photograph for me. And I sat there horrified that there we were the Human Rights Commission, and that we had given an award to such a staged photo, when what we thought we were awarding was something quite different. But the intention was a good one. Anyway, I'm sure some of you have some thoughts about that too. I now want to move on to really thinking about how we approach human rights education. So the the Declaration on Human Rights Education maps out what the international community has agreed human rights education is, and it's boiled down to its core three areas that human rights education should be about human rights. So this is the content of human rights topics. It should be through human rights, which I'll expand on more, but is really saying that we need to have human rights practices in our pedagogy, in our teaching, in the ways that we teach. And it should be for human rights, which means that it should be for social action. There must be an imperative to not just be teaching students about past wrongs, but there actually is a drive towards a social action now, whatever that is, within students' environments or homes or communities. The way we think more deeply about the through, like what does that really mean to have a human rights approach to human rights education? So how we understand it is that it means bringing a human rights-based approach to all of our human rights education work. Now, a human rights-based approach it means turning human rights from a purely legal instrument into effective policies, practices and practical realities. One model of way of understanding human rights-based approaches follows 5 principles. They are participation. So that means that participation of all involved. So here we might see the relationship of consent of those being photographed, being participatory in the production of an image, accountability, that one is always accountable to the human rights principles themselves, but also to the legal systems, and transparent as well. They should be non-discriminatory and promote equality, and there should be an element of empowerment in the process of education. And finally, human rights-based approaches require that the law recognises human rights and freedoms, and that the law itself is consistent with human rights principles. We've used this approach to develop some of the educational resources that we have, and I'm going to skip one of them because it's too long. Apologies. I'm going to go straight to the next one, and I'm not quite sure how I play. Maybe my help will. So I use this example because the Human Rights Commission didn't actually develop that. It was developed by a 16-year-old young person as part of a Bystanders to Cyberbullying program. But it's an example of the way we used a participatory mode. We empowered young people to come up with the content and the material themselves, which would engage other young people. And it also has a bystander element, which is critical to engaging young people in taking action to stand up for the rights, their own rights, but also other people's rights. So I'll finish there because I know time's up. But that's just an example of the positive, the ways that we use a human rights-based approach to our education.